And we are back once again in the throes of Eastern here in our corner of the world to talk about Shadow Priest and why it is a good spec to main. And joining me today is Marcelian. Hey man, how are you doing?
You better tell them the Shadow Priest is a good spec.
Okay. And Sunshade. How are you, Sunshade? Hello.
Hey man, Shadow Priest is awesome for raids. Yeah, tell them power infusion is good.
Okay, I'm definitely not losing my mind, pun intended. Listen, memes aside, Shadow Priest is actually a really fun spec, and obviously we're gonna talk about fun and DPS because obviously that's important, and I don't know what's more important for you. It could be fun, it could be damage, it could be a combination of both, and I honestly believe that Shadow does deliver on both, but you kind of do have to understand how the spec plays a little bit. Now, if you like the content that we do and you'd like to support us a little bit more, consider hitting the like and subscribe. And also, check the Patreon link down in the description. We have some Patreon goodies. You definitely will be supporting the content that we do, and we will be super, super grateful for it. And without out of the way, let's actually talk about Shadow Priest. One could actually ask, what is a Shadow Priest? Is it another rework? Is it the rework meme? Is it 10,000 reworks done on the spec? All right, listen. It is, I think, fundamentally a hard spec to design for the devs, and we have seen this time and time again in the last couple of expansions, pretty much ever since, I believe, Legion. There has been no single iteration of Shadow Priest that plays the same. Now, some are more similar than others, some have cross points, things that you do, the things that you do are pretty similar, but the end goal or the overarching theme kind of changes a little bit. And I honestly believe that right now in Shadowlands, it is one of the better, most interesting versions of Shadow so far, even though we kind of lost, Surrender to Madness, which was really cool, but I digress. Let's talk about currently how Shadow is playing. Now, I don't know if you've played Shadow in 10.0, 10.0.5, and 10.0.7, sure, or if you're just a new player coming into 10.1, either to Shadow Priest or to WoW in general. So I'm gonna go over how Shadow Priest is in 10.1 and what you can expect from it. Now, fundamentally, Shadow Priest is a dot spec. It's a caster that has very little mobility, and you put dots on targets, which is mainly 2 Vampiric Touch and Shadow Word Pain. They will generate insanity, deal damage, and also enable a bunch of your class mechanics depending on what talents you pick, which I'm not gonna go over all of them because there's quite a few. And to be fair, Shadow Priest has one of the more interesting talent designs because there's very few talents that just give you flat damage. They do different interactions. They give you procs, they give you all sorts of stuff, so that's where the fun aspect of Shadow Priest is coming, or at least one point of where the fun part of Shadow Priest is coming, and I digress. But you build that insanity and you spend it on Devouring Plague. In the past, you had other means of consuming, let's say, insanity, like, I don't know, Mind Seer or Searing Nightmares. Players didn't really like that. I didn't particularly have a major issue with them, but yeah, they have been taken out of the game and now you just spread it with Devouring Plague. Oh, but how do you do AoE damage, you ask? Well, there's a neat little thing called Psychic Link. Psychic Link makes it so it replicates the damage that you do to your target to all other targets that have Vampiric Touch on them. I think it's Vampiric Touch. It's who has your dots anyway, and you're gonna have dots on everything anyway in AoE. So you basically play a single target rotation on the main target, and you'll deal damage to everything else that has your dots, which you can spread, either manually casting like in the olden days, or you can use Shadow Crash with its upgraded talent just below it if you want to maintain the vestiges of your sanity. And this essentially applies your Vampiric Touch and Shadow Word Pain to 8 max targets in a big AoE, specifically if you take the talent called Misery, which makes it so that when you use Vampiric Touch on a target, it also applies Shadow Word Pain, so you don't have to use the spells individually multiple times, which can be a little bit tedious and not necessarily fun in 2023 World of Warcraft. So you do spread those in AoE with Shadow Crash, which has been lowered in terms of its cooldown, so you have access to it a lot more often. You can maintain your uptime on your dots pretty much the entire time, which is really good, and then you'll just do a lot of damage from your main priority target, which also gives you a damage profile that lets you focus on a priority target. For the most AoE packs in dungeons, there's like one target that has a little bit more HP than the others, or one target that really needs to die, and you'll be focusing on that while doing damage to everything else. it's a pretty straightforward playstyle. It doesn't really change in AoE much, so you can maintain some level of consistency. Now, there's also a neat little spell that you might be aware of if you've played in the first patch of Dragonflight, or maybe it's a new spell that you haven't seen before, which is Mind Spike. And this changes what you know about Shadow a little bit. Now, Mind Spike will replace Mind Flay, period, and it's a castable spell. It's not a channel spell, which is maybe an upgrade, I suppose. However, you cannot really play without it. It is a DPS increase by all accounts, and it's just you're always gonna have it. It is what it is. It's pretty locked into your talent tree, which is not something that I'm particularly a fan of, because one thing that you won't have with Mind Spike that you probably had in 10.1 that hasn't in 10.0 that probably hasn't been addressed yet is the instant cast procs. Now, Dragonflight, if you've played in the first season and then any casters in any amount, you'll realize that it's pretty punishing for casters. There's a lot of mechanics that make you move. There have always been mechanics that made you move. This is not necessarily something new, but these in particular are a little bit egregious. Probably Season 2 in Mythic Plus might be a little bit less so. We have tested the dungeons. It doesn't really seem like it, but at least we won't have thundering, okay? So it's not that much movement that you need. However, but you are losing those little instances of instant ability procs that you can use. Oh, I have to move now. I still want to do some damage. I'm pressing Mind Spike. You don't have that anymore. Now it's a castable all the time. I don't know if this is going to be changed because the devs have listened to a lot of the feedback regarding the rework, and they have applied a lot of it, but they haven't applied this yet. I don't think this might change up until the patch is released because it's pretty close, but it might change eventually. Until then, Mind Spike is Mind Spike, or, you know, it's Mind Spike Insanity if you pick the Surge of Insanity talent before it, which you will pick it, because otherwise you cannot pick Mind Spike, which means that after you use Devouring Plague, your Mind Spike turns into Surge of Mind Spike Insanity, basically, and it hits pretty hard. It's fun. It's one of the other procs. You have procs of Mind Blast that, you know, you can do during your rotation and have a lot of fun. Now, I talked about the fact that Shadow Priest is a spec that puts up dots on things, and the dots generate insanity, deal damage, and interact with your kit. Mind Blast also is direct damage that generates insanity, maybe one of your main source of insanity generation, or at least one of your main active source, because you have a lot of little passive sources, and Mind Spike as well, and you spend this insanity on Devouring Plague, both in single target and in AoE. Now, as you play the spec, you will build towards a specific style of build, and these builds are pretty much defined by the capstones, or at least the talents that kind of interlock with the capstones. For instance, you have massive AoE potential with the capstone N'Zoth that's kind of tied into what you will definitely pick while going to N'Zoth, which is Screams of the Void that increase the damage of your dots. This build stacks of Echoing Void, and then they can explode in AoE damage, which is a cool fantasy, it's a cool playstyle, and likely what you might be doing in Mythic Plus, maybe even in stacked raid AoE fights, because they kind of have to be kind of in a similar vicinity, the mobs that is. You can also get stuff like Yasharaj, which is a playstyle that some people vibe with, some people don't, which plays with the Mind Bender. Basically, you pop your Mind Bender and you use stuff like Mind Blast and Shadow Word Death to make it deal massive damage in AoE, kind of like in a stacked AoE as well, but it also deals decent single target damage. That's also there if you like to play it. You also have Cthulhu, which is like giga single target, although it does have some AoE component. So all of these talents kind of work both in single target and in AoE. N'Zoth maybe less so in single target, but Cthulhu essentially makes it so that it works with channel spells, which normally have Void Torrent, which is like really giga strong, really good, and Mind Flay. But since Mind Flay is going to be replaced by Mind Spike, you'll probably not have that anyway. However, you do spawn tendrils that just channel Mind Flay and Mind Sear at your targets, and I would imagine based on the amount of dots that you have up, whether or not you're in AoE or in single target, and it does do a lot of damage. It is passive, it is fun. You spawn tentacles around you, and it's a cool thing to see. And maybe one of the coolest things to see is the Yogg-Saron capstone and playstyle, which is also something that we're gonna go deeper into because it ties slightly into the tier set. Now, Yogg-Saron basically makes you spawn a thing from beyond that just blasts your target to single target, which is probably the best single target option so far, I believe. After Cthulhu was nerfed, I might be wrong, but it's probably definitely something that you will be playing. Now, how do you spawn this? Well, you essentially passively spawn Shadowy Apparitions. These are like the little shadowy forms of yourself going into your target and crushing and dealing damage and generating insanity. This is also where the tier set comes in. This is basically a core identity of Shadow Priest, which is augmented by at least 2 other talents. Auspicious Spirits, which goes into Tormented Spirits, which goes into Yox Run. All of these buff up your Shadow Apparitions. You can read what the talents do if you like to. I'm not going to go into detail, but they make them really, really good. Not to mention, with a tier set, 4-piece specifically, makes it so that every 4th Devouring Plague that you do gives you, I think, a 10-second window of extra damage on your Shadowy Apparitions, which is, I mean, pretty cool in concept. It's pretty much passive. I don't know how much you're gonna play around it. You'll probably want to, you know, spawn as many Shadowy Apparitions as possible. So likely you might want to stack Devouring Plagues. I don't know. I mean, that kind of makes it sound what it is, because Shadowy Apparitions, if you look at the talent, which is like super at the top of the talent tree, essentially makes you spawn Shadowy Apparitions when you Mind Blast, Devouring Plague, and Void Bolt. What is Void Bolt, you ask? Now we go into the actual DPS cooldowns, because it's fun to talk about capstones, but what are the actual DPS cooldowns? Which, outside of, you know, Power Infusion, which we're not gonna go into it, everybody knows what Power Infusion is, you have a choice of 2. You can either get Dark Ascension or Void Eruption, which are, you know, choice nodes. Dark Ascension is basically a buff for you, gives you little shadowy wings, and gives you a bunch of insanity as you cast it, and then you have a window of dealing extra damage with direct damage spells that are not necessarily dots, right? So not dots, stuff like Mind Blast and Shadow Word Death, which is really cool, but you'll more likely play with Void Eruption, which I think is even cooler. Void Eruption makes you go into Void form, and as you do, you blast AoE damage on everybody as you activate the spell, and you get full value from your mastery. And when you are in Void form, the ability that turns into Void form is replaced by Void Bolt. Void Bolt is a pretty straightforward ability. You shoot it at the target, it deals a lot of damage, it generates a lot of insanity, and I think it still extends the duration of the dots on your targets, mostly in single target. And when you cast Devouring Plague during Void form, you extend the duration of your Void form. So obviously this scales into more and more gear. The more Devouring Plagues you use during your Void form, the longer you stay in this alternate beefed up, steroid up version of your Shadow Priest to deal extra damage, which is really cool. And although I did mention the 4-piece of the tier set, even though it does buff you up your Shadowy Apparitions, you're probably going to want to play maybe some talents around this, which you're probably gonna end up playing anyway, but it doesn't lock you in specifically into a build for the entire patch like the previous iteration of the tier set did. So it's pretty good. That gives you variety of builds, while the 2-piece is fairly simple. You get procs of Mind Blast as you do as a Shadow Priest, and those deal extra damage. That's pretty much it. Now, in terms of the overall playstyle, it is really fun and engaging, specifically in Mythic Plus. Raid kind of has some issues. Single target for Shadow Priest is still kind of poop, and it might just be slightly poopier in 10.1, which is really weird because Shadow Priest is one of the worst single target DPS specs in the game. Now, it doesn't have to be the best, it doesn't have to always be good, but it's kind of a little bit too low for comfort. However, if this is a point of discussion between you and yourself, you know, arguing whether or not you should main Shadow Priest, or you arguing with your raid leader whether or not you should main Shadow Priest, you can essentially add to this the fact that you do have Power Infusion. For all the memes, Power Infusion does actually inherently give you a lot of damage that you bring to the group. Sure, that damage is passive from another player and kind of relies on that player playing their spec right, which most of them do, but it does add a lot of damage that it's not, you know, visible on the meters. It can be a 10% extra single target damage from a big beefy spec like Demo Locked, sometimes Unholy, but I don't know if Unholy is still going to be the recipient of Power Infusion next patch, plus Demo might actually match better with the damage profile of Power Infusion, so you do actually bring damage even though you don't actually do it yourself. Single target boss damage, because in AoE, so far from what we've played Shadow, it's looking pretty good in plus 15s in the new season. We haven't tested, you know, all of the highest super keys because still fiddling with the affixes and so on and so forth, but it's looking like a really fun spec. So if you enjoy having a lot of things to do, having a lot of procs and interactions with your rotation, it's so hard to get bored of Shadow Priest, then definitely this is a spec for you. It might take a little bit to get used to. It's not particularly a complicated spec to get into or a difficult spec to get into, but it is a lot of fun and it does have a lot of interaction, and it's hard to get bored of this. And you do have a bunch of fun stuff, like you can grip people to you and save them from danger, or slow fall, or use Mind Soothe to essentially make mobs skippable because they don't have the aggro range as high, so you can just walk past them, kind of like a mini invisibility, budget invisibility, let's say. You do have a lot of tools to kind of offset as well that you have low mobility, which, you know, there are definitely pros and cons. As for if we recommend Shadow Priest for you to main it, yes, 100% yes. It's a good spec. It's going to be valuable in groups. It does bring a lot of group utility through the stamina, through the dispels, mass dispels, power infusion, and of course AoE damage, because it is lit. Now, whether or not you will play Shadow Priest, let us know in the comment section down below. We want to know what people are playing, or at least what they think of this new rework Shadow Priest version of the spec of the class, the 10,000 rework, because I think I'm losing my mind looking at this, but maybe this contributes to the factor that you're never gonna get bored, because even if you do end up playing Shadow as your main, you're likely not playing the same Shadow every expansion, or in this case, every patch, because I don't know anymore. Listen, hope you guys enjoyed the video. Thank you for watching. Thank you, patrons, for supporting the content and making this possible. We love you guys. If you are interested in supporting us a little bit more, the Patreon link, like I said, is down in the description, and it does help us out to grow the channel and to be able to do more content like these, catered to our specific topics that maybe not everybody wants to see, because maybe not everybody wants to be a Shadow Priest, although we do think they should.
All right, everybody, take it easy. Bye-bye.
I've been loving it then, I still love it now. Still, I play WoW. Still, I play WoW. Getting better every day, let me show you how. Cause still, I play WoW. Still, I play WoW. It's getting harder to stay, but at the end of the day, it's a guilty pleasure, so just log in and play. Whether it's classic or retail, I'ma do a /bow. Still, I play WoW.